In 1969, a Pan Am flight crew walked through JFK Airport, sharp uniforms, confident stride, waved through security without a second glance. One of those pilots was 16 years old. He had never flown a plane in his life. He did not work for Pan Am. His uniform was a costume he had bought and modified himself, and the pilot's license in his wallet was a forgery he had made with a typewriter and a hobby shop decal kit. And over the next 2 years, wearing that costume, he would ride in the cockpit jump seats of over 250 flights to 26 countries on airlines' own dime, without a single one of them ever checking whether he was real. That was not even his most audacious impersonation. Before he was 21 years old, this same teenager would also pose as a doctor, running an entire hospital ward for nearly a year. He would pose as a lawyer and pass a real state bar exam to do it. He would pose as a college sociology professor and teach an actual semester of classes. And along the way, he would forge and cash more than $2.5 million in fraudulent checks across every state in America and 26 countries around the world. His name was Frank Abagnale, and this is the real story behind the man Hollywood turned into a movie, the parts the film left out, and the one detail that makes his ending stranger than anything DiCaprio ever put on screen. Frank William Abagnale Jr. was born in 1948 on Long Island, New York, into a household that looked from the outside entirely ordinary. But behind the front door, his parents' marriage was falling apart, and by the time Frank was 16, they had divorced. A judge asked him in open court which parent he wanted to live with. Frank couldn't choose between them. So instead, he did something almost nobody expects from a 16-year-old boy watching his family collapse. He simply left. He got on a train into New York City with a bank account containing a few $100s, no plan, and no intention of ever asking either parent for help again. The money didn't last, and it was there, broke and alone in New York at 16, that Frank Abagnale discovered the one talent that would define the rest of his life. He was extraordinarily good at making people believe he was somebody he was not. His first fraud was almost embarrassingly simple. He altered the account number on his own checkbook, which meant that every check he wrote came out of someone else's, much larger corporate account instead of his own nearly empty one. It worked for months before the bank caught on. By then, Frank understood something that would guide every scheme that followed. People do not verify. They trust the appearance of legitimacy, and a uniform, a title, or a piece of official-looking paper is usually enough to end the conversation before it starts. So he built himself a uniform. This is worth pausing on, because it is the single idea that every later con in his career would simply repeat in a new costume. Frank Abagnale never once claimed to be a specific real Pan Am pilot whose identity he had stolen. He invented an employee number, a fictional name, and a badge that looked correct, because he had noticed something most people never think to question. Nobody checks the uniform against a database. They check whether it looks right. If the fabric, the stripes, and the confidence all match what a person expects a pilot to look like, the verification happens entirely in the observer's head, and it happens instantly. He noticed Pan Am pilots moving through airports like they owned the place. Hotels comped their rooms, airlines flew them for free between assignments, banks cashed their checks without a second thought, purely because of the 4 gold stripes on their sleeve. Frank called Pan Am's public relations department, pretending to be a pilot who had lost his uniform, and asked where a replacement could be purchased. They told him. He bought one. He forged a Federal Aviation Administration pilot's license using a placard from a toy store model airplane kit and a typewriter, and printed himself a fake Pan Am employee badge, and then he simply started showing up at airports. He learned the trick of what pilots call deadheading, riding in the jump seat of a flight as an off-duty crew member repositioning to another city, a totally normal and unremarkable practice among real pilots. Airline staff, seeing the uniform and the badge, waved him through without a second look. He deadheaded across the country and eventually across the world, sleeping in hotels that billed Pan Am directly for the room, all on an ID that had never been issued by any airline on Earth. Here is the detail most retellings skip entirely, and it is the part that separates Abagnale from an ordinary imposter. He was 16 and 17 years old doing this. He was younger than most of the stewardesses he was flirting with. He didn't just fool overworked gate agents once. He sustained the fiction for roughly 2 years across 250 flights and 26 countries, without ever once being formally unmasked by the airline whose uniform he was wearing. And the checks he cashed along the way, using nothing but that Pan Am ID and a confident smile at hotel front desks, added up to a fortune. By the time federal investigators later tallied the damage, the fraudulent checks Abagnale wrote during his run totaled roughly $2.5 million. A figure worth many times that today. His method for the checks themselves was almost embarrassingly low-tech for a scheme this large. He would open new bank accounts using his Pan Am cover, order blank counter checks meant for tellers to handwrite withdrawal slips on, and then have them printed with his own fabricated account information. Checks that looked completely legitimate to any cashier glancing at them, because in every visual sense, they were. The forgery wasn't in the paper. It was in the story around the paper. A pilot's uniform standing at a counter made the check itself almost irrelevant to whether anyone actually looked at it closely. Eventually, even a teenage con artist has to think about what happens after the sky. Frank Abagnale did not slow down. He escalated. In Georgia, he decided he was tired of being a pilot and became a doctor instead. He forged a diploma from a prestigious university and, through nothing more than sheer charm and a resume nobody bothered to verify, was hired as the supervising resident on the night shift of a real hospital's pediatric ward. He knew almost nothing about medicine. But here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. He discovered that a chief resident's actual job, most nights, was administrative. He supervised. He signed forms. He delegated real medical decisions to the actual doctors and nurses on his staff, and simply never personally performed a procedure himself. For nearly a year, a teenager with no medical training ran a hospital ward, and the only reason it eventually ended was that he grew bored and restless, not because anyone caught him. From medicine, he decided he wanted to try law. He forged a Harvard University transcript, studied briefly, and sat for the Louisiana State Bar exam, and on his third attempt he passed it, a real legitimate state bar exam, passed under a completely fabricated identity, and was hired as a attorney in a state attorney general's office. It reportedly took the real Harvard graduate working alongside him, growing suspicious of small inconsistencies in his story before Abagnale saw the walls closing in and vanished once again. At one point, he even posed as a sociology professor at Brigham Young University, teaching an actual semester of classes to actual students, using nothing but confidence and a single sociology textbook he had read a few chapters ahead of his class. Pilot, doctor, lawyer, professor. 4 entirely different professions, each one requiring years of training and credentialing that Frank Abagnale simply did not have, and in every single one, the world let him in anyway, because he looked and sounded exactly like a man who belonged. There is a pattern hiding inside all 4 of these impersonations that is easy to miss if you only remember the movie version. Abagnale never chose professions at random. He specifically chose roles built around supervision and delegation, rather than hands-on execution. The chief resident who signs off on other doctors' work, the junior attorney buried in paperwork rather than courtroom arguments, the professor reading one chapter ahead of his own students. He was not claiming to be the single most skilled person in the room. He was claiming to be the person whose job was simply to trust everyone else's competence. It is a far easier lie to sustain, because it asks almost nothing of the liar except confidence. It could not last forever. By the early 1970s, Abagnale had become one of the FBI's most wanted men in the country. His face and aliases circulated across law enforcement in multiple nations. He was finally captured in France, arrested by French police after a former Pan Am flight attendant recognized him and reported him. He was sentenced to prison in France, then extradited to Sweden to face charges there, and eventually returned to the United States, where he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for his checks and impersonations. He served less than 5. Prison, for a man like Frank Abagnale, turned out to be its own kind of education. He later described making a study of the other inmates around him. Not criminals in the violent sense, but check forgers, document fraudsters, and identity thieves, quietly absorbing every technique and vulnerability they described, the same way he had once absorbed the small details of how a pilot walks through an airport. He was, even behind bars, still doing the one thing he had always done best, watching closely and learning exactly what made people believe. And this is the twist in Frank Abagnale's story that even the Hollywood film only partially captures. The United States federal government released him early on one condition. He would spend the remainder of his sentence working without pay for the very institution he had spent years deceiving. The FBI put him to work teaching their own agents how to spot check fraud and forgery, using the exact techniques he had personally invented to beat them. Think about how strange that arrangement actually was. The same federal agency that had spent years and considerable resources hunting Frank Abagnale across 3 countries now sat him down in front of rooms full of agents and effectively asked him to explain his own greatest hits, one trick at a time, so they could recognize the next version of him coming. It was less a punishment than a hiring, dressed up as a sentence. From that point forward, Frank Abagnale did something almost no career criminal ever successfully manages. He converted his entire skill set into a legitimate business. He founded a fraud consulting firm, developed secure check verification systems still used by major American corporations today, and reinvented himself as one of the most sought-after security consultants and public speakers in the country, an ex-con paid handsomely by banks and governments to think like a criminal, so they never had to find out how, the hard way. His memoir became a bestseller. Steven Spielberg turned it into a film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, cementing Frank Abagnale as arguably the most famous con artist of the 20th century, a man whose crimes were, by any honest accounting, genuinely serious and cost real institutions real money, yet who somehow ended his story as a wealthy, respected consultant to the very system he had spent his youth exploiting. There is a persistent, uncomfortable question that follows Frank Abagnale to this day, one that has grown louder as journalists and researchers have dug through the original court and FBI records. Several of his most audacious claims, including some of the pilot flights, the hospital tenure, and even certain check fraud totals, do not perfectly match the documented record, and some historians now argue Abagnale himself may have embellished his own legend well beyond what the FBI's paper trail can actually confirm. Which leaves this story with a strange, fitting final twist. Frank Abagnale spent his youth making the world believe he was someone he was not. And decades later, some of the very people who study fraud for a living now wonder whether his greatest and most enduring con was never the checks, the badge, or the uniform at all. It may simply have been the legend of Frank Abagnale himself. If you enjoyed this story, you know what this channel is about. The con, the cult, and the collapse, history's greatest deceivers, and the moment it all came crashing down. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.